Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, everyone. Welcome to our live for the fifth pillar on behalf of Cambridge Muslim College. We'll get started in just a minute, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا فيك من كرمك علما يا الله سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو رب افتح بالحق وأنت خير الفاتحين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Welcome everyone to our live session entitled An Inner Journey of the Hajj, in which we'll be sharing reflections from book 7 of Imam al-Ghazālī's Iḥyāʻ ʿUlūm. I'd love to hear where everyone is joining from. We typically have a global audience, and this is scheduled at a time where we hope that everyone from around the globe would be able to join. So today, what we'll do is we'll have a session in which I'll go over the teachings and some reflections drawn from Imam al-Ghazālī's chapter on the Hajj in his revivification of the religious sciences, Iḥyāʻ ʿUlūm. And we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So a quick outline overview of what we'll be doing today. So first of all, I will situate this particular chapter within the larger project Imam Ghazālī sets out in the Iḥyāʻ ʿUlūm for us to be thinking about kind of the background of his ideas and his teachings and what it is that he's intending to teach us beyond the specific discussion on the Hajj. Then we'll look at an overview of this book 7, The Secrets of the Hajj. I'll give you a bird's eye view of the various sections and discussions and the core kind of teaching or argument that Imam Ghazālī is making. And then we'll dive deep in the third part, lessons from the inner dimensions of Hajj. We'll dive deep into some of the specific reflections and contemplations and what he describes as secrets and mysteries of the Hajj pilgrimage, reflecting on particular rites or components of the Hajj. And then at the end, we'll talk about this idea of pilgrims at home. So I assume all of you are not on Hajj if you're watching this live. So we'll talk about the virtues and the merits of the 10 days of Dhūl-Ḥijjah and how we can also benefit from and partake in this blessed season of the Hajj. And then finally, we'll have some time for questions and answers, bi'idhnillah. Okay, welcome everyone. I see we have some Floridians, some Californians, South Africa, mashallah. Amazing. Welcome everybody. Pleased that you're joining us today. So beginning with Imam al-Ghazālī's Iḥyāʻ ʿUlūm, as we all know that it is one of the treasures and one of the most kind of valuable works of our tradition that has in many ways withstood the test of time. It's still studied, it's translated, it's commented upon because of how profound and systematic and organized Imam Ghazālī's work continues to be. And there's a statement that if all of the books of Islam were lost except the Iḥyāʻ, it would be sufficient because it really does contain in it all of the main teachings and themes, both outwardly and inwardly of the religion. So the architecture of the Iḥyāʻ. So Imam Ghazālī in his introduction, which is often returned to because it really very accurately and coherently and succinctly captures and frames the rest of the work. So in this introduction, which is very important, Imam Ghazālī talks about his intentions for writing this work and his concern in particular with two classes in society, the rulers and the scholars. He addresses the rulers in other works of his, and here in the Iḥyāʻ, he's concerned with the scholars and the students of knowledge and the people of religious devotion. And his main critique of this class is that they know a lot and they don't act upon their knowledge. And because of that, there's corruption, there's hypocrisy, and it affects the other classes in society who are then infected by the diseases of the scholars themselves. And so he sets out to elucidate what he describes as ilm tariq al-akhirah, the knowledge of the path of the hereafter. And he says it is in need of revival. And so he writes this book for the purpose of reviving the knowledge and the practice, more importantly, of the knowledge of the path of the hereafter. And so he divides this knowledge, this core kind of teaching of how does one attain the pleasure of God and salvation in the hereafter into two aspects, or to two kind of sub forms or channels of knowledge. So the second one, unveiling or mukashafa, he actually doesn't spend very much time on. This is kind of direct, experiential, spiritual knowledge that is directly inspired in the hearts. What the Prophet describes as, in some respects, ilham or firasa, or ilm ladunni, as the Quran describes it in Surah Al-Kahf in relation to al-Khidr. So this direct knowledge that's inspired in the hearts and reveals knowledge and immutable truths in a direct experiential way. So he says that this is knowledge that is meant to be experienced. It's not knowledge that's meant to be talked about. And that by pursuing the outward knowledge and by practicing and acting upon what one knows, that this door of unveiling is open to the heart. And we'll see throughout the Iḥyāʼ that whenever Imam Ghazālī comes to topics or realities that approximate this idea of unveiling, he actually he'll hint at it, he'll symbolize, he'll mention symbols and allusions to it, as he says the prophets do, but he will kind of step back from those topics, and he will say that those who experience it will know, and those who do not will, there's no benefit to discussing this unveiling unless it's experienced. It's like honey. You have to taste it. If it's merely described to you, it actually sounds kind of gross, right? It's the product of honeys and their digestive processes and what comes out of the bee, right? It doesn't sound very beautiful, but that those who taste it will know. And so his focus is on the mu'amala, right? Which is the acts, which is devotion, which is application of the knowledge that we acquire. And that is then its fruit, among its fruits of this practice and this application and this devotion, is that one would then have this unveiling or this experiential knowledge. So he divides the acts, right? The acts of devotion into two different dimensions: the outward, okay, the zahir, the actions of the limb, okay, prayer, fasting, hajj, recitation of the Quran, etc., and then the actions of the heart. And this is really crucial, and it's at the core and the crux of the entire arrangement and framing of the Iḥyāʼ and of the religion more broadly, that there's both the outward sunnahs that we follow, and then there's also the inward sunnahs that we try to embody and characterize ourselves by. So the outward, he says, is further divided into two parts, two components: the acts of worship, the ibadat, and the mu'amalat, which is about daily life and social interactions, social relationships, etc. And then the actions of the heart also have two components: the moral vices, the things we try to remove from the heart, diseases of the heart, and then the saving virtues, which are the things that are beloved to God, that we try to embellish the heart with these qualities and these characteristics. And so Imam Ghazālī, as you see, he's kind of a master organizer of and systematizer and synthesizer, that everything is extremely well organized, well structured, easy to remember. He's really a master of frameworks. And so you find that each of the 4 quarters is further divided into 10 books for a total of 40 books. The first quarter, the acts of worship, he begins with knowledge and then belief. And then he goes into the pillars of purity, purification, tahara, prayer, zakat, fasting. And then our book for today, the pilgrimage, book 7. And then he continues a chapter on Quranic recitation, a chapter on invocations and supplications, dhikr and dua, And then finally, a book on structuring the devotional life and the night vigil, the tahajjud. The second quarter, just a quick overview here, has to do with, like I mentioned, concerns around how to live a moral, ethical life. So a chapter on eating, marriage, earning a livelihood in both a permissible and a ethical way, the lawful and the prohibited, friendship, brotherhood, companionship, seclusion, traveling, music, and ecstasy, commanding right, forbidding wrong, and then a chapter on the essentially how to live in light of the sunnah, the manners of living and prophetic morals. And then the third quarter about the diseases of the heart. So things like miserliness, vanity, pride, delusion. And then finally, the last quarter, the saving virtues, repentance, patience, fear, hope, love, reliance upon God, and then ending with contemplation, self-examination. And book 40 somehow disappeared from my slide, and that is the remembrance of death and the afterlife. So a bridge into the next, the transition into the next world. So our book lies in the first quarter of the Iḥyāʻ, book 7, on the Hajj. And just a note for everyone that it has been translated by Abdurrahman Fitzgerald, an excellent translator, as part of this series, Fons Vitae, that has, I think, translated more than 30 of the chapters of the Iḥyāʻ at this point, and they are, inshallah, planning to finish the 40 books within the next few years. So a plug for this translation, which I think is excellent and quite reliable. Okay, so book 7, The Secrets of the Hajj. We'll begin with the introduction of the book, and I'll read that, share it with you, because as you may know, the introduction to these books, what's known as the dibaj, of books in Muslim intellectual history more broadly, and Imam Ghazālī in particular, a master of setting out and integrating and embellishing the introduction with the key themes for the rest of the book. So it's a way of introducing the reader, not just in a traditional way of seeking refuge in God and the basmala and so on, but also integrating in a very beautiful way, in very high, eloquent Arabic, some of the key themes of the book. And so Imam Ghazālī begins, Kitabu Asrar al-Hajj wa Muhimmatihi, and he says it's the, so this is the book of the secrets or the mysteries of Hajj and its important matters. And he says it's book 7 of the first quarter of the ibadat of this book, Iḥyāʻ al-Dīn. So he begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah alladhi ja'ala kalimat al-tawheed li'ibadihi hifzan wa hisna, wa ja'ala al-bayt al-atiqa mathabatan lin-nasi wa amna, wa akramahu bin-nisbati ila nafsihi tashrifan wa tahsinan wa manna, wa ja'ala ziyaratahu wat-tawaf bihi hijaban bayna al-'abdi wa bayna al-'adhabi wa midjana. والصلاة على محمد نبي الرحمة وسيد الأمة وعلى آله وصحبه قادة الحق وسادة الخلق وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So he begins praising God, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, praising God who has made this kalimat al-Tawheed, the word of Tawheed, for his servants a fortress and a bulwark, a protection. And he made al-Bayt al-Atiq, the ancient house, one of the names, the Quranic names for the Kaaba, the ancient and also the freeing house, okay? Mathabatan linnasi wa amna, echoing here the verse of the Quran that describes the house as mathabatan linnas, a place of resort, a place of safety for mankind. Wa akramahu, then he dignified this house by calling it his house, right? By attributing the house to him, that it is his house, that this is a way of honoring it and fortifying it and bestowing its favor upon the house and sanctifying it. And that he made the visitation of the house and the circumambulation, the tawaf around the house, a means of hijaban bayn al-'abdi wa bayn al-'adhab. So a veil or a protection between the slave and between the punishment of God. And then he sends prayers upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the apostle of mercy and the master, and upon his companions. And then he says, فَإِنَّ الْحَجَّ أَمَّا بَعْدْ فَإِنَّ الْحَجَّ مِنْ بَيْنِ أَرْكَانِ الْإِسْلَامِ وَبَانِيهِ وَمَا بَيْنَ أَرْكَانِ الْإِسْلَامِ وَمَبَانِيهِ عِبَادَةَ الْعُلْمِ. that Hajj is indeed among the pillars, the pillars and the foundations of the faith, and it is the act of worship of a lifetime, right? So unlike the other pillars that you renew and you revisit year after year, day after day rather, for the salah, and year after year for the zakat and the fasting, he says this is the act of worship of a lifetime, right? It's once in a lifetime that one has to fulfill it. وَخِتَامَ الْأَمْرِ. And so it's the seal of all of one's affairs, right? That fulfilling this pillar in many ways is the greatest act of worship that one fulfills in their lifetime. And it's tamam al-Islami wa kamal al-Dīn, and it's the fulfillment of the religion and the perfection of, and the completion and the perfection of one's religion. And he says that God revealed concerning the Hajj, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. That God revealed concerning the Hajj, and in some narrations in the Hajj itself, that this verse was revealed, that this day have I perfected your religion for you and completed my favor upon you and have chosen for you Islam as your religion. And so he says such an act of worship, right, requires, due consideration and devotion for us to spend a chapter of the Iḥyāʻ and for us to spend this time in these blessed days and to do this every year, really, contemplating and reminding ourselves of this blessed act and this completion and perfection of our religion. And this is what CMC tries to do year after year in commemorating this time of year with the fifth pillar. I think this is maybe the fourth or fifth year in a row that we've had programming around the Hajj in particular, because it does get forgotten, right? Ramadan, because all of us are fasting, because it's an intense month-long endeavor that we are obligated to partake in. We typically don't forget Ramadan, right? But Hajj is, unless somebody is going on the Hajj, the season of Hajj, which used to be a really rich time in Muslim culture, that it was, there's communal and social components of it, and there's a lot of cultural practices around it by which the community and by which individuals would honor the Hajj, even if they're not going on the Hajj, right? So when he describes the Hajj as the fulfillment of the worship of a lifetime and this perfection of the religion, because for us, God has just facilitated the Hajj in so many ways. You cut a flight, and within, depending where you're coming from, within less than a day, you've arrived. Whereas historically, people would set off on the Hajj, months and months before the Hajj. There would be, oftentimes it was unclear if they would even return or how long it would take to return, because it takes months to get there. People would stay, in Mecca and Medina for weeks and months because it's probably their only visit. If they were involved in scholarship or trade, they would remain even longer, perhaps years, to benefit from that cosmopolitan gathering. And then they would return home another few months of journey, right? So Muslim cultures would have all these sorts of practices around songs that you would sing for the Hujjaj, food that you would make specifically for the Hujjaj. The Hujjaj would have to put all of their affairs in order before they left, of organizing, the repayment of their debts and making sure all of their family members are taken care of financially and in terms of anything they might need in their absence, etc. So it really is, it's a very important and crucial act of worship, and one that's prepared for far in advance, years in advance. And then when one was going off on the Hajj, it would be something that would be, marked by the community. But for us, essentially, because of so many changes in society and in the way we live, unless we're going on the Hajj or we know someone close to us going on the Hajj, we typically don't really pay too much attention to this blessed time of year. And so it's important, as Imam Ghazālī is saying here, such a pillar and foundation of the faith deserves attention and devotion in knowing how to perform it and knowing its virtues, whether or not one is going on the Hajj that particular year. So the chapter, he says, is divided into the book, al-Kitab, is divided into three abwab, or three chapters, as we would say. The first chapter looks at the merits of the Hajj and the merits of Mecca and the Bayt of the Kaaba. And also he appends to that a discussion of the merits of Medina. and of even the merits of setting out on a journey to Mecca, Medina, and Baytul Maqdis as well, Jerusalem. So he does this kind of comprehensive discussion of the merits of all of these acts of worship. And so he mentions the verses and the ahadith concerning the Hajj and its merits. For example, the verse of the Quran that we often remind ourselves of, where Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam says, or rather God commands him, وَأَذِّن فِي النَّاسِ بِالْحَجِّ يَأْتُوكَ رِجَالًا وَعَلَى كُلِّ ضَامِرٍ يَأْتِينَ مِنْ كُلِّ فَجٍّ عَمِيقٍ. Right, that he tells Abraham, and Abraham, in the midst of this desert, right, this valley, this desolate valley, before he even builds the Kaaba, he commands him, right, to call the people, to proclaim to mankind, and nas, all of mankind, the pilgrimage. Invite them all, and that we know from hadith tradition that he in fact did make a call and an adhan for people to come to this place that God chose and sanctified among all of the plots of earth and all of creation, that he chose that particular place for secrets that are known only to him, and that Abraham proclaims the Hajj to all mankind, and God tells him, أَذِّن لِلنَّاسِ بِالْحَجِّ يَأْتُوكَ رِجَالًا, that you call adhan. Don't worry, don't ask questions about how and when and where. Just call the people to the Hajj, they will come, right? They will come they'll come to you on foot, they'll come to you on camel, they'll come from every distant track, right? And this is what we see today, literally a global institution from every corner of the earth, people coming in answer to the call of God upon the tongue of Abraham alayhi salam. And as we perform the Hajj, when we say, right, the ihram and what we repeat until we reach the Kaaba, the talbiyah, labbaik Allahumma labbaik, right? Here I come, my Lord, here I come, right? We are responding to the call of God mentioned in this ayah upon the tongue of Abraham, right? So we're saying labbaik is a response to someone calling you, right? So in kind of Muslim culture, historically, and kind of the adab of Muslim culture is when a parent or a teacher calls you, they call your name, come here, you say labbaik, here I am. So labbaik is a response to a call, to an invitation, to being summoned, right? So we are responding in our Hajj to this call of Abraham. So Imam Ghazālī in this beginning chapter, he talks about the merits of the Hajj and reminds us, brings together, collates all of these verses and ahadith of the Hajj and the merits of the Hajj, that of course we know that the one who fulfills the Hajj pilgrimage will be forgiven all of their sins and will return as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ teaches us, as the day that their mother bore them, right? So the fresh slate to begin anew. Another verse, just one more that I'll mention here, that Imam Ghazālī mentions, is in Surah Al-Hajj, both the former ayah and this ayah, that God says, لِيَشْهَدُوا مَنَافِعَ لَهُمْ, in describing this call for them to come to the Hajj, and he says, why لِيَشْهَدُوا, right? What is the purpose of the Hajj? لِيَشْهَدُوا مَنَافِعَ لَهُمْ, that they may witness, right? لِيَشْهَدُوا مَنَافِعَ لَهُمْ, benefits for them, right? That's the purpose. If the verse about Ramadan that God says, لَعَلَّهُمْ, for taqwa, right? The verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, that it is كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِن قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, right? For taqwa. That's the purpose. And the Hajj is for benefits, that you witness benefits, right? And the rest of what we'll talk about in terms of the inner meanings and inner dimensions of the Hajj is Imam Ghazālī kind of contemplating, as many did before him and many did after him, what are these benefits that God intends for us through the Hajj. So the first chapter on merits. The second chapter is really an overview of the Hajj in terms of its outward acts. So of course, any type of discussion of meanings and dimensions and secrets and mysteries is building on a solid foundation of performing the outward obligation correctly, right? There is no inward meaning and benefits and spiritual, growth and benefit if we're not first fulfilling that essential necessary component of the outward form of the act being according to the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And so before diving into the spiritual dimension, Imam Ghazālī spends quite a bit of time just outlining what we know to be the various rites of the Hajj, the requirements, the integrals, the conditions, right? The ihram, what do you have to do when you start the ihram? What are the conditions for the man, for the woman? How do you perform the tawaf? And as we know, Imam Ghazālī is also a jurist, a master jurist in the Shafi'i tradition. The Shafi'i school itself, its lineages, its transmission goes essentially through Imam Ghazālī and Imam al-Juwayni. They're the main line of the school, and its transmission and preservation goes through the works of those two Imams. So Imam Ghazālī is not just a spiritual teacher and systematizer of spirituality and ethics, but also of Islamic law in the Shafi'i tradition, and his views and his works in fiqh are essential to the Shafi'i madhab. It's a cornerstone of the madhab. So he's also a master jurist, as many other master kind of spiritual masters in our tradition are, that they tend to also begin as and continue to work in other fields of knowledge, including law and theology as well. So he goes through, and again, part of the systematizing, he loves the number 10. And so he says, here are 10 outward rites or components of the Hajj, from the travel, from the outset to the return. He talks about, the requirements of when you set out, repayment of debts, finding good companions, etc., the ihram, entering Mecca, the tawaf, the sa'i. So he enumerates 10 of these acts of the Hajj. And this is not Imam Ghazālī. This is not based on Imam Ghazālī. This is just a visual of the Hajj for us to remind ourselves that we begin with the ihram. If you're doing Umrah before Arafah, then you would start with Tawaf al-Qudum, the sa'i as part of the Umrah. Then you would begin in Mina the day before Arafah, Yawm al-Nahr. And then you would spend the morning in Arafah. This is the essential pillar and the beginning formally of the minimal Hajj that one would do. Then you spend that night in Muzdalifah. You collect your pebbles to prepare for the Jamarat. You begin with the first of the Jamarat, Jamrat al-Aqaba, and then you continue to be in Mina for what's recommended, the 3 days. You sacrifice your animal, and then you shave or trim the hair, and then you are officially out of ihram. You do the tawaf al-Ifadah, the main tawaf that's integral to the Hajj, and then you would return to do the 3 days of Mina. Sorry, that would be here. So you begin with one pelting of the Jamarat. You do the sacrificing of the animal. You do the Umrah built into the Hajj essentially here. The acts of the Umrah, so the Tawaf al-Ifadah and the Sa'i, then you would return to Mina. And then when you're leaving, or when you're completing the Hajj, depending on how long you stay, you would do the Tawaf al-Ifadah at the end. And then he also mentioned at the end of the section, the visiting of Medina. And he spends quite a bit of time on that because it's kind of highly recommended, and it would be very strange if someone was to do Hajj and they'd go to Mecca and not visit the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he spends quite some time describing that and mentioning the virtues and the merits of time in Medina. The first text he mentions that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Man zarani ba'da wafati, faka'annama zarani fi hayati." So it's a weak hadith, but it's supported in its meaning by many other hadith, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that whoever visits me after my death, it's as though he visited me in my life, right? So a strong encouragement from the Prophet to visit Medina at any time, but in particular in the season of Hajj. So that's the second part, essentially the fiqh of Hajj. And then finally, the third section discusses the inward spiritual dimensions, mysteries, acts of the Hajj. And here he begins with 10 kind of ethical considerations or etiquettes for the Hajj. So this chapter also divided into two parts. The first part is some of the adab, daqa'iq adab al-Hajj. So 10 things, like making sure that one's provisions are lawful, a number of etiquettes of consideration for the animals and for the mount that one is carried upon to the Hajj. So if you're on a camel or another riding beast, that he emphasizes in many of these etiquettes that one not overburden it, that one take care of it, make sure that it's treated with kindness, not to overload it, etc. He talks about the importance of humility in the Hajj, and in how one spends in the Hajj, how one walks in the Hajj, how one engages in the Hajj with other people. So he mentions 10 of these etiquettes as well. And then finally, the second half of this third chapter is where he contemplates the internal a'mal al-batina, as he describes it, the internal dimensions and spiritual meanings of the various outward rites of the Hajj that he has discussed. And so that's what we'll look at now, inshallah. And just to give you a small sample of some of these meanings and lessons that we can also take and benefit from in these 10 days and beyond. And so he begins this section by saying, اعلم أن أول الحج الفهم أعني فهم موقع الحج في الدين ثم الشوق إليه ثم العزم عليه, and so on. So he says, know that the beginning of the Hajj, basically, right? It begins with understanding, okay? And he says, I mean by that, understanding the position or the importance of the Hajj within the religion. And after one understands, after the fahm, after the understanding, then you have longing, okay? Because it's something you don't know, you don't understand its virtues and its benefits. You're not able to then long for it or desire to do it. So when you understand, then you have longing. And then when you have longing, you have this, this azm alayhi, that you have this resolve to now undertake the Hajj, not just outwardly, but also with one's heart. And then one would then take the next steps of actually performing the pilgrimage and taking the means to the pilgrimage. So then he begins with explaining what he means by this understanding. And he says, I'm sharing with you, some keys to open this door, right? And when you open this door, you will understand that, what lies beyond the outward forms of the Hajj. And that then every heart will be able to, benefit from these secrets and these mysteries and these spiritual meanings according to the purity and the state of that heart. Okay, so he's giving us keys to unlock, a treasure chest. And he's saying, and then according to the state of the heart and its purity, the further meanings will be divulged and opened up to each heart according to its capacity. So regarding these understandings, he says, no, اعلم أن لا وصول إلى الله سبحانه وتعالى إلا بالتنزه عن الشهوات والكف عن اللذات والتجرد لله سبحانه في جميع الحركات والسكنات. So know that there is no arriving to God except by leaving behind one's desires and cutting oneself off from the impermissible pleasures, and of making oneself completely devoted to God in all of their affairs, in all of their stillnesses, and all of their movements, that they are for God and for God alone. But he says that the ego essentially is what veils us from being able to reach that state of kind of complete devotion and adoration of God. And for that reason, because of this, the ego, the nafs, being this obstruction to the realization of the desire of the heart to know God and to arrive at God, for that reason, the self has been given certain, acts to perform that help it to transcend beyond that preoccupation and fixation on its lower desires. And he says essentially with the Hajj that it has this unique status of including and entailing many acts that one, doesn't understand and one cannot rationalize. And this is actually why it is of such a high station. So he says that's why the self has been given to do these acts in the Hajj, right? That it has no understanding of its meanings, right? لا تهتدي إلى معانيها العقول. So the intellects, right, cannot reach, cannot, ascertain, cannot determine any purpose behind them. He says, like Ramil al-Jimari bil-Ahjar, like the throwing of the pebbles at stones, okay? And like the passing between the Safa and the Marwa, okay? So he says, acts like this, in them, يظهر كمال الرق والعبودية. When we're asked to perform acts that we have no understanding of what they're for, okay, we don't know how, what's the benefit behind them. He says it's in acts like this that the perfection and the completion of ubudiyah, of our servitude to God, comes to completion and comes to fruition. And he says, because in zakat, for example, right, you have this meaning that you understand. And in, the benefit of others and social good, etc., it's rationalizable to some extent as to why the rich should give the poor. And he says in fasting, you have this clear breaking of the shahwa, breaking of the desire, that is, the means that the ego and Satan use to move us away from God, right? So in fasting, we experience and we see this breaking of our desire. And in prayer, for example, we also see that it has the meaning of humility and of submission to God. But things like, the sa'i between Safa and Marwa, and the number, right, like 7 times, right, from this point to this point, the throwing of the pebbles, right, things like this, these are a'mal فلا حظ للنفوس ولا أنس للطبع فيها. These are acts that the self has no share in it, right? There's nothing that the self is going to enjoy. The nafs is not going to enjoy or benefit from or rationalize, or the human nature isn't inclined to do things like throwing stones at rocks as an act of devotion, right? And the aql is not, the intellect has no understanding or ability to understand and rationalize the meanings behind this, right? And so the fact that it's complete and utter servitude and submission to God actually makes it, it renders the ego submissive in the way that God desires, right? So if our purpose in being created, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, I have not created humans, God says, I have not created humans and jinn except for the purpose of ubudiyah, to serve and to worship me. That is the purpose for which God created us, right? And if all of the acts that we're asked to do are basically things that we would do anyways, right? Many people will fast anyways, right? Many people do fast anyways, even when it's not Ramadan, right? Many people, recognize that a regular practice of meditation and contemplation and repetition of certain phrases, right? Meditation, mantras, things like that, has benefits, and you can study the brain waves and you see the impact on the nervous system. Like, it has these intrinsic benefits, whereas the Hajj, in many ways, doesn't have intrinsic benefit, right? It doesn't have these rationalizable, let's say, elements. So it's ta'abbudi, it's completely ta'abbudi, that it's super rational, and it asks of us complete and utter submission to God, which is ultimately the purpose of our creation. And it's a school and a training in this meaning, and towards this ethic, towards this state of submission to God. So he recognizes this, and he says that this is, and people often will ask questions like, what is the purpose behind this? What is the purpose behind this? And in the Hajj in particular, we would say in many ways it's super rationalizable, and that we can then think about some of the wisdoms and lessons and benefits for us, but we don't know the specific purpose of many of these acts. And so that's why we say labbaik Allahumma. And in some reports that the Prophet says, labbaik bihajjatin haqqan ta'abbudan wa riqqa, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's talbiyah is that I come to you, O Lord, in I respond to you, O Lord, haqqan, in truth and fully, and ta'abbudan, and in worship, wa riqqa, in servitude to you, O God. So this is the spirit of the Hajj, and this should be the spirit of our entire lives in seeking to fulfill this purpose. So this is the kind of the framing of the Hajj, of this core meaning of servitude and submission to God, and responding to God in whatever he asks of us, with our hearts first and foremost. But in order for the heart to reach and attain that state internally, that we're being helped by this outward movement of the body in order to bring the body into submission. And through that, the heart is then brought into submission. And so many of the acts that he then details in terms of the inner meanings and secrets and benefits, spiritual benefits of these acts, we see this kind of parallelism between what we do outwardly and then what's intended inwardly, even in the names of some of these acts. So one example here is the ihram and the talbiyah, right? So we know that the ihram is what the garments that are donned by the hujjaj, men and women, and that its meaning, the very meaning in the root of the word ihram, comes from the root harama, like the word haram, right? And so it has the inward kind of state of the ihram has a connection to the linguistic origin of the word ihram itself, right? So it has both the meaning of sacredness, okay, because we do not enter the sacred haram, okay, from the same root, the haram of Mecca. We don't pass the miqat unless we're in this state of donning this garment outwardly, and inwardly that the heart is now being sanctified. It's turning away from the world, from its habits, from its comforts, right? The ihram, especially for the men, it's not comfortable. It's actually very uncomfortable from what I hear, right? So we're being asked to leave all of that. Do not put any, cologne or any scent, don't beautify yourself. For women also not to beautify themselves. And we're going, we're turning away from everything else towards the sacred precinct. And we're also, the second meaning, what is forbidden for us, we're making things that are typically, or God is making things that are typically permitted, haram upon us in that state, right? And in that place, in that sanctuary, we don't kill, we don't hunt. There's special rules for the haram and there's special rules for the ihram, right? And so again, this meaning of this core submission and servitude to God is definitely a very, very evident in this particular step of the Hajj. And then with the beginning of the ihram, we also begin the talbiyah, right? The responding now to God, labbaik Allahumma labbaik, here I am at your service, O Lord, here I am. And we repeat that, and the Hujjaj repeat that, and those in Umrah repeat that until they arrive to the house, right? So the sunnah is to repeat it repetitively, not to stop, except for other adhkar that one would recite, or prayers upon the Prophet. But the goal is for the heart, for the tongue to be busied with this remembrance of God outwardly, and this, this calling or responding to the call of God outwardly, and then that the heart is then learning and is becoming submissive to God in the sense of, there's nothing more important than what God asks of me and then my journey to God, right? That we proclaim this profound, surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we come to him answering this call by which he invited us, and the rest of the talbiyah, of course, labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka labbaik, right? This essential oneness of God, that there's nothing, no associate, no sharik, nothing that of an attachment or of preoccupation that distracts us from responding to God and from wanting to be completely for and with God. Innal hamda وَالنِّعْمَةَ لَكَ وَالْمُلْكَ لَا شَرِيكَ لَكَ, that there is no praise and no power except that it is from God and belonging to God. So everything is with God and from God, and we praise him and we seek the other things that we desire from him and by him. And so that is the outward, forms of the ihram, the talbiyah, and then inwardly cultivating these meanings in the heart. Then one of the first stops on the Hajj, as we know, and the essential pillar of the Hajj also, is the wukuf, the standing at Arafah. Okay, and this is prior to, entering upon the Kaaba, prior to descending upon the house of God, that one has to make this essential stop at Arafah, which, if you miss the day of Arafah, then you've missed the Hajj. So it is an essential component. Okay, and the word Arafah itself has in it and echoes some of the meanings and the lessons intended from Arafah, which it means, it has two resonances. One is knowing or understanding, okay, and the other is, perfuming or scenting, making something fragrant, Okay, and both of these meanings are intended within the particular components and practices of Arafah. So at Arafah, the Hujjaj, they stop at the station and they stand and seek forgiveness from God, right? So it's a time of imploring God for forgiveness and for making us worthy to enter upon his presence. So to enter upon the presence of God or the house of God physically, one has to be cleansed. And as we know, to enter upon the spiritual realm and for the heart to be in the presence of God spiritually, it also has to be cleansed. It has to be a sound and cleansed heart. And so it's a time of renewal, a time of tawbah, when we acknowledge our sins, our rebelliousness, our forgetfulness, our heedlessness, and we remind ourselves of our unworthiness as true servants of God, right? And then we also acknowledge with that this other kind of component of our shortcomings, which is God's all-encompassing knowledge of our shortcomings, his mercy, his generosity, his limitless grace in forgiving and effacing our sins. And so capturing both sides of knowing Arafah, right? Man arafa nafsahu, arafa rabbahu. That statement, famous statement that whoever knows themselves knows their Lord. Because when we know ourselves to be deficient and weak and heedless and forgetful, then we know our Lord to be forgiving and giving and generous and forbearing, etc. and so on. All of these beautiful names of God and attributes of God by which he envelops us in his mercy and in his love. And so we know from the various texts on the day of Arafah that God, he celebrates in the presence of his angels the Hujjaj on Arafah, asking for forgiveness, and he affirms to them that he indeed has forgiven them their sins. And in other teachings that there's none who is, there's no greater sin than a person who attends Arafah and he believes that God did not forgive him, right? So we have to have always a good opinion of our Lord, and always expect from him mercy, expect from him what is in keeping with his attributes, not what is in keeping with our attributes and our shortcomings. And so having this boundless kind of hope and optimism and expectation from God always, at every moment, but in particular in the time of Arafah, this blessed time in this blessed place. And for those of us who are not at the Hajj, as I'll mention in the end, that there is a kind of recommended practice of spending, the day, or at least spending a part of the day of Arafah, seeking forgiveness from God, renewing our repentance to God, and praying, making dua for all of our needs, inwardly and outwardly, personally and communally. At least between, before Maghrib on that blessed day that we also try to fast. So we have a part and a portion in our homes and in our communities also of honoring and benefiting from the Hajj. So after being cleansed, inshallah, and forgiven at the Hajj, and Imam Ghazālī, one of the things he mentions in relation to Arafah and in relation to the Hajj more broadly, is that one of the secrets of God's acceptance and forgiveness of the Hajj, of all of the Hujjaj, is in fact that among them, there are some that are pure in heart and who are among the righteous and the saints. And so when he talks about the inner meanings of the Hajj, he reminds of that meaning, that it's part of its blessings and its secrets is that it's a communal endeavor. So all of the hearts are gathered upon God in that place. And some of those hearts have a direct, direct access and direct answering of their prayers because of their devotion to God. And he mentions, for example, a story reported from one of the tabi'een that he performed Hajj one year, and when he was in Arafah, he fell asleep. And he saw two angels that came to him in this dream, and they said to him, do you know how many people performed Hajj this year? And he said, sorry, the two angels are actually speaking to each other. So one angel asks the other angel, do you know how many people came to Hajj this year? The other one says, I don't know. And then the questioner angel responded, there was 600,000 who performed the pilgrimage to the house of our Lord. And then he asks him again, do you know how many of them were accepted? And he says, no, I don't know. And he said 6 people of the 600,000 were accepted. So then the man wakes up, this Tabi'i scholar, he wakes up and, he's very disturbed by this. And he says to himself, if there's only 6 people out of 600,000 who've been accepted, surely I won't be among them. And, he moves on to the next station in the Hajj. And he's just really down because of this vision. And then he falls asleep again the next night, and then he sees these angels once more. And then they, repeat the same discussion, the same exchange. And then one of them says to the other, do you know what decision our Lord has made this night? And he said, no. And he said, he has given every one of the 6 100,000. Okay. So he said, for each of the 6 who were accepted, he gives each of them 100,000 accepted along with them. And then the Tabi'i says, I woke up with such rejoicing as cannot be described, right? So a God, he accepts the Hajj of many, and this is not anomalous in terms of our deeds, but he accepts on behalf of others the Hajj, even if it's deficient. And this is a source of hope and optimism for us, that even if we fall short in our acts of worship and in our Hajj, then inshallah we are accepted by the blessing of those who are accepted in the wake of their acceptance, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So just maybe 1 or 2 more, because I think we're coming upon the hour now. So the tawaf that we go around, we circumambulate, we circulate the Kaaba 7 times. So Imam al-Ghazālī reminds us that tawaf is like prayer. In fact, it is. He says, "Annahu salah." Right? It is prayer, and so we should be present in the tawaf with our hearts, with reverence and with fear and with hope and with love, as he already instructed us to be present in our prayer. So he refers us back to Kitab al-Salah, where he talks about the importance of khushu' and presence in the tawaf, as we should be present in our prayer. And that's really important because, again, if you've been to Mecca, you see people are kind of a little distracted when they're in tawaf, and maybe they're on their phones or they're chit-chatting, whatever it might be. Other people are doing dua and dhikr and reading Quran persistently, but he's telling us it's prayer, right? That tawaf is prayer, and it has many of the conditions of the prayer. You have to be in wudu, you have to have your awra covered. Like it actually shares with the prayer many of the requirements and the conditions. And so he says, know that when you're in tawaf, that you are mutashabbih bil mala'ikat al-muqarrabin, right? You are imitating the angels, right? The angels that are close to God, who are constantly circumambulating around the throne of God, right? And he said, don't think that the intention of the tawaf is that you circumambulate with your physical body around the house, right? That's not the maqsood. That's not the purpose of the tawaf. Rather, the purpose of the tawaf is that your heart be in remembrance of the Lord of the house. So your body is going around the house, and your heart is revolving around presence with the Lord of the house, right? So that the heart, right, learns to only be in remembrance of God and only begin with God and end with God. So like we begin the tawaf, right, at the Hajar al-Aswad, you begin there and then you end the tawaf there. He's saying that the heart learns to begin with God and to end with God. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, right? That we ask God to make us for him and through him, by him and to him, right? That we begin with God in mind and we do what we do for the sake of God, and we end in repentance to God in acknowledgement of our deficiencies. And so he continues, etc., reminding us of some of the inner meetings of the heart, and he makes this really, this important kind of parallel between the physical body and its movement around the Kaaba, and the heart and its movement around the Lord, the presence of the Lord of the Kaaba. And then he mentions also the Hajar al-Aswad, which we are in each of the ashwat of the tawaf, in each circumambulation, that we ideally kiss it. If we can't kiss it, that we point towards it and that we read some of the recitations that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taught us. But he talks about here the meanings of drawing on the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ about some of the meanings of the istilam of the Hajar al-Aswad. So he says, فاعتقد عنده, at the black stone, أنك مبايع لله عز وجل على طاعته فصمم عزيمتك على الوفاء ببيعتك فمن غدر في المبايعة استحق المقت. Now he says that you should, have conviction and believe when you are performing this act, the istilam of the touching of the black stone, that you are making an oath, a bay'ah, an oath with God to obey him. So resolve to fulfill your oath, for whoever breaks an oath deserves chastisement. And he's basing this on the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, narrated by Ibn Abbas, that's al-Hajar al-Aswadu yaminullahi azza wa jalla fil ard yusafihu biha khalqahu kama yusafihu al-rajulu akha. That the black stone is akin to the right hand of God on the earth, right? With it, God shakes hands with his creatures as a man shakes hands with his brother. Okay, so like this idea of, if you have a وَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ عَنِ الْأَمْثَالِ, right? This is a similitude that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself is drawing. But like if you had a king and you were committing yourself to the service of the king, right? You come and you kiss their hand, right? So this is our opportunity to renew our oath, our covenant, with this covenant that we took in pre-eternity with God, to obey him, that he is indeed our Lord, that this is a renewal of that covenant, of that allegiance, of that commitment to God, committing ourselves once more. Again, outwardly, we kiss the black stone, and inwardly, we are committing with our hearts to a renewed fulfillment of our covenant with him. And that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in another hadith tells us that on the Day of Judgment, the black stone will come and it has a tongue, lahu lisan, okay, and it has two eyes, and it has two, shafatan, two cheeks. So it's impersonated, the black stone. And what does it do? يَشْهَدُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ لِمَنِ اسْتَلَمَهُ بِحَقٍّ. That it will bear witness on the Day of Judgment for whoever touches it and kisses it with bihaq, right, truthfully, sincerely, right? So all of these meanings, right, in truth, with reverence and awe, sincerity, really believing that this is a renewal with their heart of their covenant with God, right? Not with boredom or kind of casualty or a lack of awareness of what they're doing and what they're involved in. And so, again, these teachings from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ alluding to these deeper, not even alluding in this instance, really teaching us about these inner meanings and benefits of the Hajj. And so, again, Imam Ghazālī in this chapter, and we're out of time at the hour here, but each of the acts of the Hajj, I mentioned the Ihram, I mentioned Arafah, I mentioned the Tawaf, and I mentioned the touching of the black stone. But for each of the other acts of the Sa'i between Safa and Marwa, of this, the Mabit, the spending the night in Muzdalifah, the pelting of the stones, all of the various rites of the Hajj, which he has already outlined in terms of how we fulfill them outwardly. He now talks about in this latter part of the book of Hajj about some of the inner meanings and benefits. And as he mentioned at the beginning of the section, he's giving us keys by which we can open the doors to these deeper realities. And then, the Ummah has been contemplating the benefits and the meanings of these rites since the beginning of Islam. And before that, even we know that Adam alayhi salam, that he was given the location of Mecca and that he did the Hajj there, Ibrahim and all of the prophets, right? So this is in an ancient practice of all of the prophets and communities before us that we are very blessed to continue to the present day. And so we continue, and when we go, that we're seeking you take these keys with you from Imam Ghazālī, but that then your heart in its sincerity and its truthfulness is awakened and opened to these deeper meanings and benefits from the Hajj. So just to shift to the last things that I'll mention here before we take your questions, inshallah, is this idea of pilgrims at home. And I'm borrowing this from Ansa Tamara Gray, who has the Rabata Foundation, where they do actually quite a full program for women in Ramadan that they call pilgrims at home. And I just really liked, I like that kind of framing of it, that we're at home, but we're still kind of pilgrims undertaking this inward journey. And so as we know that, the Hajj season, or the first 10 days of Hajj, when the Hujjaj are in these places, these blessed places, this blessed time, that we also have a share in benefiting from these days. As the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ teaches, ما من أيام العمل الصالح فيها أحب إلى الله من هذه الأيام, that there are no days that are more beloved to God in which good deeds are performed than these 10 days, right? So these are the best days in which God loves that we perform good deeds, the 10 days of Dhūl-Ḥijjah. And so akin to, as we know, Ramadan, right? That many of the blessings and reverberations of Ramadan emerge from the revelation of the Quran in this time, right? Part of a big portion of its blessings and its importance and its significance is because Shahr Ramadan alladhi unzila fihi al-Quran, right? The month of Ramadan in which the Quran was revealed, right? And so that revelation and that moment in which God speaks to humanity, right? It becomes an entire month of devotion, of performance that we honor. So similarly, the days of Dhūl-Ḥijjah, right? The blessing of the pilgrimage that a part of the Ummah is performing, right, extends into, it provides blessings and opportunities and sacredness for the rest of the world and the rest of the community and the rest of humanity, even those who are not in that place. And so we all have a role in venerating the days and the times of Allah, in particular these 10 days. وَمَنْ يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِنْ تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ, that whoever venerates and shows due reverence for the the signs and the symbols of God, that is indeed from the taqwa, from the belief and the fear and the taqwa of the heart, right? So God praises those who honor these blessed times. And so some of the actions to perform in these 10 days, and this is something again that you probably heard before, but we have to remind ourselves of from year to year, is of course the fasting of the first 9 days of Dhūl-Ḥijjah, and in particular the day of Arafah, about which the Prophet Muhammad said that he expects and he yahtasib, right, that whoever fasts the day of Arafah would be forgiven their sins of the prior year and the year after, right? So a highly commendable action, as we mentioned before, on the day of Arafah, to also spend some time, even if it's just a few minutes, renewing our tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and making dua, occupying our time, our day with prayers and supplications on that day. Also, recommendation of being in a lot of remembrance of God in these days, right? As the Quran says, وَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ فِي أَيَّامٍ مَعْلُومَاتٍ, right? To remember God in these known days, right? These blessed days, meaning the days of Dhūl-Ḥijjah, and in particular the tahleel, the tahmid, and the takbir, la ilaha illallah, alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, etc. In these days and in the days of Eid as well. The recommendation of performing an udhiyah, a sacrifice, in these days is also recommended. And again, any other act of worship that's recommended in general is doubly recommended in these days, whether it be increasing in our ibadat, our nawafil, our prayers, giving of charity, qiyamul layl, service to the community, whatever it might be. And just one way of encapsulating this is a statement of Ibn Hajar in his commentary of Fath al-Bari, that he says that the reason that these 10 days are, one of the reasons or the wisdoms of these, the virtues and the merits of these 10 days being the greatest of the days, is that it gathers in it all of the most important forms of worship, right? So the repetition of La ilaha illallah, the first pillar, the prayer, right, that it increased time of prayer, fasting, that we're recommended to fast in these days, zakat or charity, so to give sadaqah, and some people even will give their zakat every year in this month or in these days. And then, of course, the pilgrimage, right? So it's a time when you gather all of the acts of worship, and there's no other time in the Muslim calendar when we would do that. And so with that, reminder and encouragement to myself first and foremost, and to all of us to try to endeavor to do a little bit more and to take a little bit of our time each day to honor and revere and benefit from these blessed days. We can, inshallah, shift to any questions that you might have. And inshallah, we will, if you haven't already sent in the questions, you can still do that now, inshallah. Okay, so let's see what questions we have here. I see the last question from Lily about if holding wudu for tawaf is difficult, waswasa or health, are there any concessions or exceptions? So essentially any situations which would give you a concession in regular prayer. So let's say somebody has they have a difficulty maintaining their wudu because of urine, spotting of urine, or bleeding for a woman, whatever it might be, or gas, right? That there's a rukhsa specific for people in that situation. That if one is in that situation, then they would be given the same dispensation for tawaf. As I mentioned, that many of the conditions and the exceptions to the prayer also extend to the tawaf. But for the waswasa issue, I would say that requires kind of more of a direct intervention to see what's behind the waswasa. Is it that the person thinks certain things break the wudu that don't, or is it kind of a psycho-spiritual situation, whatever it might be, depending on that, a different kind of intervention would be required. And there are also some additional concessions or dispensations that are given specifically for Umrah, or Hajj rather, Hajj and Umrah, because of the crowds, right? So for Shafi'is, for example, if there's lamps or touching, skin-to-skin touching of non-mahrams in normal circumstances, that would break wudu, the Shafi'is provide a dispensation specifically for Hajj, in order to make it easier for people because of the difficulty of not accidentally touching in Umrah. So in any case, there's a discussion there. I would recommend speaking to or seeking the direct kind of advice from somebody of knowledge, that you could describe your situation to a bit more in more detail. Okay, another question. Can you tell us more about al-Bayt al-Ma'mur and how it relates to the inner meetings of the Hajj? Yes, so al-Bayt al-Ma'mur is described in some of the texts as a kind of above the Kaaba, the physical location of the Kaaba, that there is another house, okay, like the Kaaba, akin to the Kaaba, around which the angels are constantly circumambulating. So when Imam Ghazālī talks about some of the inner meanings of the tawaf, he says that man tashabbaha biqawmin kana minhum, right? He says that whoever imitates a people, this is actually a hadith, that whoever imitates a people is like them, or he is one of them. Whoever imitates a people is one of them. And so he says, by imitating the movement, the constant uninterrupted movement of the angels in circumambulation around the Bayt al-Ma'mur, that the ta'if, the person who's in tawaf, becomes more and more angel-like, more and more angelic, right? And so the hope is that that our circumambulation is, it's a reality that's there. We're just usually not aware of it, right? But the more that we open our hearts to these meanings, when we go to the Hajj, we know that we're, with the Ummah in circumambulation, and then we're also aware that the angels, in a realm that we cannot perceive with our naked eye, that they are also in circumambulation of the Bayt as well. And that is since time immemorial, right? That has been their practice. Like there are angels that have been in sujood since God created the heavens and the earth, and they haven't even risen from that sujood, and other angels that are constantly in praise of God in various modalities, that there are some that are constantly circumambulating the Bayt. Okay, there's a couple of like fiqh questions, so I'm actually not going to answer fiqh questions because, as you know, there's different madahib on these issues. So I would recommend to speak to someone who's qualified in fiqh of your particular school to answer that, especially the cutting of the nails and removal of the hairs. So there's different details for that in different madhabs, whether and what happens if you accidentally do it and so on. So I'd prefer not to get into that, but there are resources for that. Okay, in pre-modern times, I understand that pilgrims would depart by road just after Ramadan and return in Muharram. Did the communities that sent them off also take this as a season of Hajj? What did they do in these months in addition to Arafah fasting and 8 days? Yeah, it is the season of the Hajj, and there's the 4 sacred months, and this month, Dhūl-Ḥijjah, is the most sacred of the 4 months. And the 4 months were oftentimes when people would be in journeying to Mecca and returning in Muharram or thereafter, also a sacred month. So I would say the season, what we know from some of these kind of historical works would be, part of it is the sending off of the Hujjaj, and that would be a time of celebration and of, renewal for the community as well. They're sending off one of their own that they may never see again, that person is fulfilling their obligations, their debts, seeking forgiveness from anyone they might have hurt or harmed, and also preparing, that if they don't return, that their family is taken care of by the community. So it's a time of communal gatherings, or, songs in different cultures that would be sung for the Hujjaj, as I mentioned. And then as, the sacred months between, Ramadan, Shawwal, and then Dhul-Qa'dah, Dhūl-Ḥijjah, many kind of blessed months that are also in which we're encouraged to be in more worship and devotion to God. So they're enjoying that time and making the most of that time. And then in the 10 days of Dhul-Ḥijjah, we have the benefit of like watching the Hajj if we so desire, or receiving pictures of the Hajj, whatever it might be, or stories or calls or whatever it might be. But they have to use, their imagination. They have to use their imagination to be thinking about, this is this day of Dhul-Ḥijjah. They must be here in this part. And if you haven't been to Hajj or to Mecca, that even requires a little bit more imagination, right? That you're trying to think about, what does the Kaaba look like? What does it mean to do? So you have to really you have to make an extra effort to be present. And because there was fewer distractions, I think they did make that effort. And of course, a big part of the season of the Hajj is also about like longing and intentionality, right? So I'm not on Hajj this year, but I pray and I ask and I intend that perhaps next year I'll be among the Hujjaj, right? And then to give life to these 10 days as well in whatever way that we can. So it is a season, in particular these days, and then with the Eid days as well, with the udhiyah, the distribution of the sacrifice to different parts of the community, different segments of the community, the repetition of the takbirat of Hajj, etc., in the Eid prayer in the days of Eid. So all of these things connecting us with the Hujjaj and reminding us of the blessings of these days as well. So I think in as much as we can do some of that, especially if we have children in the home, and we can decorate the home as we do for Hajj, and to teach them about the Hajj and try to bring it to life in our communities. I think that that would be something that's meaningful and inshallah is beloved to God. Is there an optimal time to choose to go to Hajj? Should we go when we're older, as we're meant to assume we won't come back? The recommendation and actually the obligation is to go as soon as you can, right? Because there is in some Muslim cultures, this idea of I'm going to go at the end of my life just so I can, be purified from my sins at the end of my life. I don't want to go when I'm young. I still have a lot of things to do, other priorities, but that's kind of antithetical to the whole spirit of the Hajj, because in as much as you're saying we assume we won't come back, right? That happens quite rarely. And, people are the chances of dying at Hajj are quite low versus the chances of being hit by a car. Let me just put it that way. So, and even if it was a higher possibility of death, that's not really a reason for us not to go to Hajj. But that the obligation is, as soon as we can go for Hajj, as soon as we have the money, we have the health, we should go as soon as possible, right? And we don't know how long we're going to live, right? So it's an essential component and pillar of Islam. The sooner we can do it, the sooner that we fulfilled, a fifth of the religion. And to do it when you're young also, provides us with the benefits of having the stamina and the strength and being able to walk parts of the Hajj. Imam Ghazālī mentions that's one of the etiquettes, is to walk if you're able. And so to do it as soon as we can. And it's in the meaning of, in Surah al-A'raf, when Musa alayhi salam comes to his seclusion with God, he leaves Bani Israel, and he says, وَعَجِلْتُ إِلَيْكَ رَبِّي لِتَرْضَى, right? He says that I have hurried to you, my Lord, that you may be well pleased. عَجِلْتُ إِلَيْكَ. As soon as he could come, as soon as he could leave, he come. عَجِلْتُ إِلَيْكَ رَبِّي لِتَرْضَى. I hurried and I made haste to you, my Lord, so that you may be content. So this posture of, I'll get to Hajj eventually when I can, when it's convenient, when it's not too hot, right? And this is actually the Shaitan, he doesn't want us to be on Hajj. Let's just put it mildly. And the verse in the Quran that says, where Shaitan promises before God that he will, stand in the way of the path to good. What's the ayah that he says, can't remember the ayah offhand, but essentially Shaitan says that, I will stand in the path. I will stand and obstruct their path to good, right? That the tafsir of that ayah is that, one of the tafsir of the ayah is that this is the road to Hajj, right? So he stands and tries to prevent people from going on the Hajj. So I think, the optimal time to go to Hajj is actually not to choose to go to Hajj. The optimal time to go is as soon as you can go. And if we're not able to go, we're not there this year, then we make the intention, inshallah, it's going to be next year, right? So every year we renew the intention that inshallah next year, if I'm able to go, and then Allah will facilitate the means and the obstacles for us. But to always desire and to go. And this is one of the things I really love about CMC's fifth pillar program. Last year, I listened to many of the podcasts of the Hujjaj who'd been in former years. And it was actually really, I felt like, okay, I really want to go to Hajj next year. Like just, it's already in the back of my mind, but hearing the stories and hearing the accounts, and that's part of this, season of Hajj and this cultural, social experience of Hajj is for us to share and to encourage with other people, to share with other people our experience, the positive parts of it in particular, and to encourage one another to go on Hajj and, to form Hajj groups and to try to go on the Hajj as soon as possible. Any other non-fiqh questions? Lily's asking about women going on Hajj without mahrams. So there's actually a very, very old fatwa that would allow a woman to go on Hajj, especially if it's her obligatory Hajj, so long as she is, safe. They would say like to go with a group of women. And of course, in this time, Imam Ghazālī even talks about this, like the dangers on the road to Hajj, that there's these like highway robbers and brigands along the Hajj route that would stop people and steal their wealth, etc. So it actually wasn't safe for a woman to go. It wasn't safe for anybody to go alone. And even in the Hajj caravans themselves, it was still quite unsafe. So that's the context of the women shouldn't go alone. That's part of that context. But even in that context, even with the highway robbers and the brigands and whatever else, the fuqaha said, the Hajj is obligatory. And if a woman is able to go and she doesn't have a mahram, that she can still go with the group as well. So that's definitely permitted. Whether or not a woman chooses to go without a a mahram or family members or whatever it might be, that would be left up to her as well. So I think that's all we have for today. I don't see any other questions. So inshallah, with that, we can end our session. Thank you for attending, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put a lot of blessing in what remains of these days. I think, are we day 5 now? I think day 4 or 5. And it's a blessing to just be together in community and reflecting upon these meanings and making these intentions, as I see some of you are making, to go on the Hajj soon, inshallah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make that easy for us and give us a beautiful experience at the Hajj and an accepted pilgrimage bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Jazakumullah khairan, everyone. Enjoy, inshallah, the rest of these blessed days. And Jazakumullah khair for attending. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.